Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vincent Rougeau, Dean of Boston College Law School and Director of the Boston College Forum on Racial Justice in America. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Rappaport Center's kickoff program for the spring semester, Police Reform in Massachusetts, Next Steps. As we are all painfully aware, we're living in extraordinary times, but from a historical perspective, not unprecedented. Racial injustice has abounded across the United States since the founding of this country. And in the past several years, we have borne witness to far too many deaths of Black and Brown individuals at the hands of the police. Police reform has rightfully taken on a sense of urgency. In Massachusetts, we've been fortunate to have strong relationships among and between law enforcement and communities. The systems are not without flaws, but the will is present in our Commonwealth to take action and to effect change. Today, we will all learn about the recent police reform bill enacted in Massachusetts, the negotiations, compromises, challenges, and successes, and the work still to be done to right the wrongs and to move us forward in our collective efforts to ensure justice for all. Thank you to our esteemed panelists and moderator, and to all of you for being here. And now I'll turn this over to Professor Dan Canstrom, Faculty Director of the Rappaport Center.
Thank you very much, Dean Rougeau. And I want to echo the words that you said about the importance of this event and your thanks to our panelists and moderator and to all who are attending. As Faculty Director of the Rappaport Center at BC Law School, I just wanted to personally welcome everybody to our kickoff event of this semester, and especially welcome the students in our new seminar on law and public policy, which is connected to the Rappaport Center. I truly could not imagine a more timely, more engaging, and more significant opening panel than the one that we have for you today. Please visit our website to see the other outstanding presentations of our senior fellows this year, AJMEL QUERESHI, John Miller, and other presentations that we have planned throughout the semester. Now, before I introduce our excellent moderator for this panel, I just want to give you a couple of details. First of all, the event program with bios of all the panelists is available in the chat function, as well as other valuable resources that the panelists have given us on the police reform bill and how it's developed. Second, I want to tell everybody that this program is being recorded. And finally, that we're going to have a time for Q&A later on. Please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to pose your questions in that forum. And so now it is a great honor for me and a privilege to introduce our moderator, who, as many of us know, has also been deeply and powerfully engaged for many years in the work we will discuss today. She's been engaged as an activist, as a lawyer, and as a leader. TANISHA M. Sullivan is the president of the NAACP Boston branch. With one of the largest membership rosters in New England and a legacy of committed service, the NAACP Boston branch is a leading voice on issues of racial diversity, economic justice, equity, and opportunity in public education, and the elimination of health disparities in and around the city of Boston. TANISHA's other full-time job, bracket, exclamation mark, and close bracket, is as Associate General Counsel at Sanofi Genzyme. She has also served in a senior policy role as the Boston Public Schools Chief Equity Officer. TANISHA earned a BA in government from the University of Virginia. I'm very happy to say that she earned a JD from Boston College Law School and an MBA from Boston College's Carroll School of Management. She serves on many nonprofit boards and has won many prestigious civic and professional recognitions, including the 2018 Leading Woman Award from the Girl Scouts of Eastern Massachusetts, the MLK Legacy Award from St. Cyprian's Church, and the Boston Bar Journal's 40 Under 40 recognition. Of particular relevance today, I want to point out that she convened a coalition of community-based leaders to prioritize police reform strategies in Boston and at the state level. She was appointed to the Boston Police Reform Task Force and was a co-drafter of the Office of Police Accountability and Transparency Framework that has now become part of Boston's municipal law, and which I should say the students in the seminar are going to read and look at very carefully for tomorrow's class. She worked with legislators and the governor's office to shape the mass police reform bill that was ultimately signed into law by Governor Baker that we're going to discuss today. And finally, Tanisha's generous contributions to the work of the Rappaport Center, including serving on our advisory board, are too numerous to list now, but are very, very much appreciated. So with that, Tanisha, I'm going to turn it over to your capable hands to moderate our panel. Thank you again.
Thank you so very much, Professor Canstrom. It is always wonderful to be back on the BC Law campus, albeit virtually. It's great to be back amongst fellow Eagles and those who love BC and the work that we do there. I also want to thank, of course, Lissy and the entire Rappaport Center family for the work that we continue to do through this particular center, and of course, Dean Rougeau, for continuing to keep the doors of BC Law open to the Rappaport Center. I think now more than ever, we are coming to understand, or the world is coming to understand what we already know, and that is the important linkage between public policy and lawyers and the role of the law. So thank you all very much. So I do have the honor of moderating today's webinar discussion, and I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by 4 individuals who have just done incredible work to help advance, certainly work throughout the criminal legal system, but we'll talk specifically about the transformation that has happened and is happening as it relates to policing. And each of the 4 comes to this work looking at it through different lenses, legislative lens, advocacy lens, law enforcement lens, all of which is so critically important to actually not just to spur meaningful dialogue on this topic, but I would say to actually getting things done. That's my thing. How do we get it done? And all 4 of them have been part of really getting things done in this space. As was noted, I spent much of the last year or so focused very intensely on this issue and really seeking to advance sustainable change at both the municipal level here in Boston and also across the Commonwealth writ large. Last fall, just a little note, but I think important for this conversation, last fall, I actually accepted an appointment from Sanofi, which is the company that the other job that I have, Dan, from Sanofi to serve in a fellowship. So I'm currently a fellow in what's called CEO Action for Racial Equity. It's a national fellowship that is focused on developing and advancing public policy solutions to address racial inequality in economic opportunity, education, healthcare, and of course, public safety. And so I look forward to, bringing to that fellowship all of the work that we've been able to do here in the Commonwealth and really look at ways to scale it on a national level. So I'm super excited about today's conversation. And with that, I want to introduce to you our guest for today. And I'm going to start with my very good friend, my co-conspirator in all things good trouble, IVÁN Espinoza-Madrigal. IVÁN is the executive director of the Lawyers for Civil Rights. And what I want to emphasize here for folks is that LCR was actually founded in the late 1960s by John F. Kennedy. We all know John F. Kennedy, of course, has deep is from Boston. And one of the social contracts that emerged as a result of his leadership was Lawyers for Civil Rights. Today, as we know, LCR here in Boston and across the country is a leader when it comes to the advancement of civil rights and advocacy. And specifically here in the city of Boston, IVÁN has really led the charge in solidifying LCR as truly a leader when it comes to using litigation as a tool to advance and really bolster advocacies for certainly communities of color, but also for immigrant communities and low-income communities writ large. IVÁN has certainly established himself as a leader across the Commonwealth on all issues related to racial justice and civil rights. I did all of that just because I know him so very well. I didn't have to look at my notes, IVÁN. I do want to lift up, though, IVÁN too, for his work, has been widely recognized and honored because of the impact of the work, including BBJ 40 Under 40 recognition, the Boston Bar Association's Beacon Award. He received the University of Pennsylvania's MLK Award in Social Justice. He was recognized as the best LGBTQ lawyers under 40, and the list truly does go on. IVÁN is graduated summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Pennsylvania, and he also received his JD from NYU School of Law. IVÁN serves on the board of the New England Foundation for the Arts and also Eastern Bank. Brian KYES is the chief of police for the Chelsea Police Department. He is also the president of the Massachusetts Major City Chiefs of Police Association. Chief KYES currently serves, as I mentioned, as police chief for the Chelsea CPD, and he's held that position since 2007. He originally joined the Chelsea Police Department in 1987. He is a licensed attorney here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We always end up with all these lawyers on the panels, you know. Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and is a 2002 graduate of Suffolk University Law School. Chief KYES is very active in various committees with the Mass Chiefs, serving as the chairman of the Legislative Committee, the vice president of the Mass Police Accreditation Commission, the vice chair of the Metro Boston Homeland Security UASI region. He's a member of the Mass Chiefs Executive Committee, a member of the Municipal Police Training Committee, can't wait to delve into that, and the MPTC Standards Committee. The chief also teaches in various police academies, as well as at Endicott College, Bunker Hill Community College, and Fisher College. AJMEL QUERESHI serves as the senior counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, not to be confused with the NAACP. In that role, QUERESHI maintains a diverse caseload spearheading LDF's work in the areas of education, economic justice, among others. In 2019, QUERESHI led LDF's efforts in Bradford v. Maryland State Board of Education, a case on behalf of a class of school children in Baltimore who had been denied a constitutionally adequate education. In 2018, he served as lead counsel for LDF in multiple suits challenging the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's suspension of housing regulations that would have made housing more accessible and affordable. In addition, he serves as director of the Civil Rights Clinic at Howard University School of Law and has taught several courses in their law program. Under his direction, the clinic has filed amicus briefs in several cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 2018, the clinic filed a lawsuit challenging the Trump administration's termination of the DACA program. His teaching has been recognized by Harvard Law School, which awarded him in 2016 the Wasserstein Fellowship. And as we heard, he is with us in 2021 as a senior fellow in residence at the Rapapport Center. We are super excited to have you join this family. And I do believe we will be joined during this program by Representative Carlos Gonzalez, who is a Massachusetts State Representative representing the 10th Hampden District. And he's the former, or I should say immediate past chair of the Black and Latino Legislative Caucus. With that, I want to jump right in. And as I noted at the beginning, we have with us a panel of experts who really come at this issue of policing from different lenses. And I do want us to kind of start at the federal level and to get a broad picture of kind of what's happening across our country as it relates to the transformation of policing. Then of course, we'll delve in a little bit deeper into kind of where are we going from here. So with that, I want to first turn to AJMEL to provide us with kind of the federal landscape.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining in the midst of everything that's happening. Thank you to Dean Rougeau, thank you to Professor Kanstrom, to Ms. Sullivan, and all of my colleagues on the panel today. What I've been asked to do is, as Ms. Sullivan mentioned, is provide an overview of the work that's going on around the country related to police departments and reform of police departments. As I tell my students at Howard University School of Law, the work of LDF fits into really a three-part model. Litigation, I'm mostly a litigator at LDF, so for the most part, I'm involved in suing people in class actions, mostly for injunctive relief, that is to change policies and practices. So that's really the first arm of what LDF does, which is in the courtroom. The second arm, and I think this is measured as well in the work going on around the country related to police reform, is legislative advocacy. That is work beyond what's happening in the courtroom, but is really in legislative bodies throughout the country to get change that you can't get through the courtroom or you've been unable to achieve through the courtroom. And finally, and it shouldn't have put it in this particular order because maybe it's the most important, is the public advocacy in organizing. What we've seen around the country as thousands, tens of thousands of individuals have marched around the country this summer calling for recognition that Black lives matter. And I think that's seen in the work, as we'll talk about in a little bit, with regards to police reform as well. So LDF really, our work around police reform, but around other issues related to housing and education as well, really fits that three-part model of litigation, legislative advocacy, and organizing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that LDF has done, and I'll clue in work that other organizations like Lawyers for Civil Rights, like the National Lawyers Committee, like the ACLU's national and local offices have been working on related to police reform. The first major component of police reform work is the litigation work that's been happening around the country. We've seen it this summer. A lot of it has been litigation related to restricting the use of military technology by police against either peaceful protesters or protesters against whom, if force of some sort is necessary, less than the use of military force. So LDF has specifically been involved in a lawsuit in Louisville, Kentucky, where Breonna Taylor was killed, and there were a series of protests that happened in May, June, and July. Many of the protesters in Louisville were met with the use of tear gas, flashbangs, and other forms of unnecessary force, as we allege in our lawsuit, which we filed on July 30th, 2020. What the lawsuit sought was damages for individuals who were injured by the use of tear gas, flashbangs, and other forms of unnecessary force, and also sought injunctive relief, prohibiting the use of those methods of force, as well as military type force and technology against peaceful protesters in the future. There's been similar litigation around the country. Many of you probably have heard of litigation in Detroit, litigation in Denver, litigation in Portland, and probably what has gotten the most attention is litigation by the ACLU's Washington, D.C. affiliate in Washington, D.C. related to the former president's march from the White House to a church nearby and the use of tear gas in that march. So that really is the first piece of what's going on around the country, is litigation seeking to prevent the use of unnecessary force against individuals on a class-wide and injunctive basis. So that's the first piece. The second piece is legislative efforts at reform. These are efforts that are going on simultaneously in addition to the litigation that we've talked about, that LDF is involved in, but also many of our partners around the country, as well as many advocates in all 50 states are working on legislation that seeks to do some of the things I'm going to talk about now. One of the big pieces of legislative reform has been qualified immunity and seeking to limit or end qualified immunity. As you know, qualified immunity is a defense that shields officers from being sued and has been interpreted by courts so broadly that it oftentimes in certain areas allows officers to engage in unconstitutional acts with relative impunity. The reason that is, and I think the judicial branch is part of the reason for this as well, is that what essentially qualified immunity requires is that a previous court to have found the specific conduct unconstitutional. And more we have courts not getting to the inquiry of whether or not something is unconstitutional, but just stopping at the question of whether or not a previous court has addressed the matter and found it unconstitutional. And if they stop there and never actually address the substantive underlying matter of whether or not it should or should not be unconstitutional, it creates a pattern in which no court ever finds anything unconstitutional, and the doctrine of qualified immunity essentially shields a large degree of police misconduct. LDF has also been involved in efforts to change the statutory state of mind required to violate the federal criminal rights statute. The current standard is willful, and LDF has been working on changing that standard from willful to reckless. That is, when an officer knows of a substantial risk of serious harm, but acts regardless. Right now, the standard is willful under the federal criminal civil rights statute. LDF has also been involved in work around the country related to repealing or amending state and local laws that shield misconduct disciplinary records from the public. LDF has been working to adopt a federal standard that requires the use of force as an absolute last resort and incentivizes states through federal funding mechanisms to implement this standard. LDF has been working to prohibit racial profiling and require robust data collection on police community encounters. As we've seen in many jurisdictions throughout the country, oftentimes Black individuals are disproportionately stopped and arrested. LDF has also been working to prohibit all police neck hold maneuvers, which I noticed that the Massachusetts law does, which is a very good thing. And LDF has also been working to prohibit the use of no-knock warrants, which I know the Massachusetts bill addresses to some degree as well. So those are the legislative efforts that LDF has been involved in around the country. Finally, at the same time, LDF has been organizing for what we believe is transformative change with regards to the role of police in society. We've been working to organize to draw additional attention to a goal of drastically reducing the presence and need for armed law enforcement in Black and Brown communities around the country. Part of that may be developing alternative methods by which police aren't necessarily the right department to respond to certain mental health crises or social problems, working to redirect funds for police departments to underfunded agencies and community-based programs that might be better equipped to address the experiences or behaviors that are often inappropriately criminalized, such as homelessness, substance use, and behavioral health crises. And I think the fact that those things are criminalized in many places goes beyond the fault of any one police department or police departments as a whole. That often is a legislative problem in terms of what is or is not criminalized. LDF has also been a vocal advocate for removing police from schools. LDF has been working to eliminate federal programs that provide military equipment to law enforcement. From our perspective, we oftentimes believe that that military equipment is unnecessary for police to be able to do their job and do it well. We've been working on developing a national public database with government authorities that would compile the name of officers who've been fired, forced to resign, or had their licenses revoked, so they can't move from one department to another if they've had a previous negative experience with the public. And we've also been working with communities to negotiate police union contract provisions to ensure police officers are held accountable. That puts me at 7 minutes, which was what I was allowed to provide this national overview. I'm looking forward to talking about more of this with all of my colleagues and appreciate all of your time today.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. That was an outstanding overview, and really appreciate the framework, looking at this issue through certainly a litigation lens, a legislative lens, and then overall just thinking about the role of policing, what it is and what it could be looking forward. I want to next go to Representative Gonzalez to talk about this work at the state level, and certainly speaking to the most recent policing reform legislation signed into law by the governor earlier this year.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tanisha, and thank you all my colleagues and in the panel. And thank you, Tanisha, for the great work that you did in advocating for the police reform bill, because again, although it was a legislative decision, I believe that all the protests that took place throughout the country, but also here in the city of Boston and Springfield and all throughout Massachusetts, as well as all the advocates and the agencies that provided the insight and sometimes the dialogue that was necessary for us to get this over the top. But again, we started in June 2nd with demands on the police reform and accountability bill. Now, I think it's important to note that June 2nd was the day we stood in front of the State House with federal, local, and state officials demanding a 10-point plan. But prior to that, the Black and Latino Caucus for the last 2 years in my tenure as the chair, we've been discussing about peace officer standard of training, police accountability and reforms with the governor. And we were working alongside his office and others throughout the building and the State House to make sure that we can achieve some of those goals. With Breonna Taylor and the national incidents that took place, Mr. Floyd, obviously it took it came to the forefront sooner than later. And our 10-point plan, when we look at it, was to establish from the state perspective, there was 4 goals: peace officer standard of training, civil service review and oversight commission, commission to on structural racism, and adopt statutory limits on police use of force, as well as banning chokeholds in the state of Massachusetts. I can honestly say that we've achieved our 100% goal for where we stood at the time on June 2nd. Obviously, we had further intentions to work on other issues and legislative matters that were critical and important to the communities of color particularly. And we set forth on that goal, but we did that starting our first meeting working with the police officers and the police unions. And it was the first time the Black and Latino Caucus was ever had a meeting in the Boston Police Union Hall. And I think that's important to note, because I think that when we look at legislation or difference of opinions, if we don't sit to talk to each other, we will never get to solutions. And I think it's important that people were demanding change, and it was important that we all come together to make that a reality. The federal side was to put, on the federal government, they were supposed to work on improving oversight nationally and have an independent national program to investigate police officers. They also were looking at a DOJ statutory authority to investigate individual instances of racial profiling and adopt unbiased law enforcement policies in all levels of government. And then on the municipal side, declare racism as a public health crisis, and many local municipalities did that. I can say, as well as in the state, we were able to do that as well. And then also in the municipal side, they wanted to create civil review boards and commissions with subpoena powers to investigate allegations of law enforcement wrongdoing. Well, I think on the state level, we all know that the bill came out, and we were able to achieve, again, our peace officer standard of training, our civil service review oversight, commission of structural racism, adopting the statutory limits on the police use of force, which is still being worked at now, but we did ban chokeholds.
Rep. Gonzalez. I think we lost him for a moment. I'm sure he'll come back. Keep things moving. I am going to, well, I'll wrap up, just picking up on what Rep. Gonzalez was sharing. When we look at really the 10 points that many of our elected officials of color kind of put forward as really necessary reforms when we were thinking about policing, we can see across the board that all of those at both the local and state level had significant movement at a minimum, but in many respects, we were able to achieve through work at both the municipal level and the state level, many of the objectives, not the least of which was the post, the police officer standards and training, which was a significant and really a significant piece of the legislation and one of the cornerstones. To Rep. Gonzalez's point, one of the reasons I believe we were able to get that one across the finish line is because of the work that had been done leading prior to June of 2020 by legislators and members of law enforcement, as well as the governor's office, to try to look at standards and training of police officers across the Commonwealth. And so with that, we could not have a better person to speak to that work and the importance of really this being a process that includes law enforcement, not just at the table, but with a voice that helps to shape the transformation, then Chief KYES. And so Chief KYES, I want to go to you next to talk a bit about the work that has been done here in the Commonwealth and specifically the role of law enforcement in that work.
Sure, thank you very much, Tanisha. So yeah, no, I mean, just to continue on with what Rep. Gonzalez was stating, I couldn't agree more in representing the police chiefs and police officers in many respects across the Commonwealth. We're on the same page, and the rep knows that, and we go back and we think, well, first of all, just in talking about post in general. So the Mass Chiefs, we have been advocating for a post in our state, peace officer standards and training, since 2010. I know the governor, with former Secretary Dan Bennett, he put together a committee. I was on that committee with many others, and we had been meeting quarterly. I think this started probably 4 years ago or so. I know the rep in the Black Latino Caucus had some panel discussions up at the State House that I was a part of. And for those folks that are listening, they might, they hear the acronym POST, and as we explain it, like, what does it really mean? I mean, essentially, it's somewhat simplistic in that the training that officers do go to the police academy, certainly officers in our state and throughout the country. When they go, they get training that is very comprehensive, approximately 6 months worth of training initially. We call that baseline training. And essentially what they would do is they would get certified. like an attorney being licensed by the Board of Bar Overseers. So they get this license, this certification. And then the post, this entity, this 9-member commission also has the ability, if an officer doesn't keep up with their training, or if they commit certain types of misconduct, they can be decertified. So this is something that's significant. This is something that certainly allows for a level of consistency across the state. If myself being a police chief here in Chelsea, if I was someone that an officer that committed some type of egregious act, or even perhaps something, not egregious, but something that I said, something this particular person, in my opinion, doesn't deserve to wear the badge. And if I decide I'm going to move for termination with the assistance of the city manager, that might be one route, whereas a police chief in another jurisdiction might feel differently. So this particular, the idea of decertification by a separate and independent, a neutral and detached commission allows for a sense of consistency whereby they can be decertified. So the chairman, Rep. Gonzalez, knows we actually met, I think, on this subject, and I believe it was in June. I went out to Springfield, I met with the rep and others, and we had a discussion that basically when the rep laid out his 10-point plan, and I remember going through it bullet by bullet, and we just stood there in agreement saying, we agree with everything that's laid out. I have a letter in my hand that I actually sent to the governor, lieutenant governor, the Senate president, and the former speaker back on August 4th, which basically took the 10-point plan and showed and demonstrated how, in terms of the Mass Chiefs, that we align with what needs to be done. Certainly the legislation that we have right now, and for the folks that haven't looked at it, it's comprehensive, meaning that, a piece of legislation comes out, it might be a page or 2 or 10 or maybe 15. This is about 140 pages. There's a lot of different, there's a new chapter in the legislation, chapter 6E. There's a lot of sections of the law that have been amended, but I think there's certainly a lot of work to be done, meaning the logistic, the language of the legislation is there, and we can read it and we can understand a lot of it. Some of it, I guess, it's a bit complicated, and perhaps we can talk about that. But I think the logistics of getting post off the ground, naming those 9 members that are going to be represented on the commission, which is going to be civilian led, for lack of a better term. There's going to be 6 individuals that are non-law enforcement officers out of the 9, which is significant. And basically all the different other logistical components. There's going to be a division of police standards, which is a whole entity to be formed under post, a division of police certification. So there's a lot of moving parts that, and I tell you, the in terms of the deadlines of July 1st, or this July 1st for this to be up and running. I'm optimistic it can happen, but kind of realistic that it'll probably push down into the summer, maybe the fall. But nonetheless, we'll get this off the ground. And just saying that the support of the police chiefs is absolutely there. And just kind of, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one thing, as the chairman mentioned regarding a ban on chokeholds. I just want to kind of put it out there, only because you see it comes up in the news, and for folks around the Commonwealth to look at this, the implication is that now there's a ban on chokeholds. So therefore, in the past, in Massachusetts or perhaps elsewhere, but talking about Mass, that police officers must have been trained to use chokeholds. Police officers must have been using chokeholds in a general sense. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I've been a police officer here now for 34 years. We've never been trained to use chokeholds. If someone, and we've had policy, strict policy language, certainly our language, and I know this for a fact, in going back to 2015, after the tragic death of Eric Garner in New York City, any language in use of force policies was revisited and modified to make it even more clear that chokeholds are not allowed. So the fact that it's now codified into statutory language, that's great. But the reality is, in our policies across the Commonwealth, it's always been strictly prohibited for many, many, many years, dating back, certainly before my time as well. But that's it. I just wanted to kind of start out and lay that foundation. I hope there's some questions that I can address specifically from where I sit as a police chief. And I know my friend IVÁN is on, and I just wanted to mention this as well, that coming from a city like Chelsea, it's a very, very diverse city. We have issues in the city pertaining to other agencies at times as it involves immigration. IVÁN knows my stance on that. The federal government and state government in many respects could be the same, but in many respects are different. The city of Chelsea is deemed to be a sanctuary city. We never look into anyone's immigration status. at all. I mean, it's not part of our mission. So this is it's kind of a separate thing, but in a way it's not. It's something where we need to work with our residents. We need to work with our business folks, our clergy, everyone, all the stakeholders involved to make our various communities across the state as safe and secure as possible. And with that, the last key word that I want to mention is just the word trust. This is definitely an enhancement of trust, a two-way street between police officers that are out there keeping our folks safe, and then certainly the people who live here across the Commonwealth. I'll pause there. I could probably talk all day, but I won't. I'll pause there. And I'm happy that my voice survived. I'm just coming back from COVID after 2 weeks, but I'm here for any other comments or questions. Thank you, Tanisha. I appreciate it.
Good to see you, and glad that you are well.
Thanks very much.
Absolutely. I really appreciate Chief KYES, you taking us back and really helping folks to understand that this work has been a long time coming, right? And I would argue that one of the things that helped position Massachusetts to very quickly, folks should remember that, Governor Baker filed the post legislation at the end of June. Very quickly out the gate, kind of put a stake in the ground that this is what we're going to do. And that didn't just happen overnight. It happened, I believe, because the groundwork had been laid. And then the timing was right. And, so many members of the legislature, including Representative Russell Holmes, who we all know, he is, he has been on the forefront of these issues for so very long, recognizing also the importance of, again, making sure that this wasn't just transformation work that was happening from an advocacy standpoint or an activist standpoint, but that was inclusive of law enforcement. And so I definitely want to thank you for your work and most importantly for your leadership on this particular issue. And I want to go to IVÁN next to talk about the role of advocates. Rep. Gonzalez kind of touched on this in his opening remarks, where he talked about having the voice of advocates can be helpful to legislators and policymakers, especially, when we're doing this type of work. And so can you just talk about the role of advocates specifically as it relates to some of the work that we've been able to accomplish here in Boston, but certainly across the Commonwealth? And yes, Lissy, I'm going to go to Q&A. I'm going to pick up a few questions after IVÁN.
Thank you, Tanisha. Always a pleasure to be in partnership with you. We are big fans of the work that you have been leading and that the NAACP has been leading. Such a critical voice. And I, for one, I am delighted that the NAACP is mentioned expressly by name in the police reform legislation with specific mentions in many of the studies and commissions that are established by the legislation discussed by Representative González. And so just want to give a shout out there because I think that's wonderful. I also want to thank Dean Rougeau for welcoming us today, as well as Professor Kenstrom. And I couldn't agree more. Chief, you and I have gone back a long time on many of these issues, and I have to tip my hat in the way that you've been approaching these policing matters, particularly in the community where you run things, which is Chelsea, Massachusetts. Generally low income, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately immigrants. And so those are complex social fabrics, and you navigate them well. And so I also want to recognize that. So I wanted to answer your question, Tanisha, by starting at some myth busting. I think it is so critical for us right out of the gate to dismiss the myth of exceptionalism or of the fact that we are immune here in Boston or in Massachusetts or in progressive New England from the trends that we have seen happening across the country. Already several panelists mentioned the names of people whose names we should mention and elevate, such as George Floyd, of course. But we forget that we have our own George Floyd here in Boston. We have Terrence Coleman, who was fatally shot by the Boston police after his mother called 911 to get an ambulance to take him to the hospital. And she specifically said, please just the ambulance, no police sirens, because my son has a mental health condition and I don't want that to be a triggering or aggravating factor here. I need to get my son to the hospital. And the ambulance arrived with a patrol car, clearly not following the specific instructions requested by the mother. And within short order, her son was dead. And so that is an example of the type of thing that happens right here in our own backyard. And that case remains unresolved. Lawyers for Civil Rights represents Hope Coleman, the mother of Terrence Coleman, in litigation against the Boston Police Department. And the fact that we are still litigating that case just shows the depth of the problem. An incident that took place in 2016 should have been immediately resolved and investigated, and the responsible folks should have been held accountable accordingly. And yet we're still fighting that case. We're still fighting to have Terrence Coleman's dignity and life celebrated and recognized with what really is yet one more incident of police brutality visited on Black lives. And so for us at Lawyers for Civil Rights, this is work that we have been building on and advocating on well before George Floyd. And here in Boston and in municipalities across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, you don't have to go to Minneapolis for these incidents. And so you're right, it is in fact intense advocacy that has made the ground fertile for much of the reform that we're talking about. And we are lucky to be able to enjoy the support of folks like Representative González, like Chief KYES, who are bringing authentic leadership and recognizing the complexity of the issue and also the need for reform. There are many things that this bill does here in Massachusetts that has already been discussed, like banning chokeholds, among other things, including the creation of these commissions. Lawyers for Civil Rights, along with the NAACP, has a seat. We have a seat in one commission. I think you guys have a seat on a lot more than one, but we have a seat in the commission to make recommendations to improve and modernize training for police officers and use of force. So those are important, and we're going to be contributing directly to those. But the NAACP has a seat, for example, in the commission dedicated to studying qualified immunity, which was something that was left at the table. We weren't able to get qualified immunity reform done through this legislation. And so there's still work to be done. So I'll point that out in terms of qualified immunity being an area of intense interest. But there are also other things. We have facial recognition technology that is increasingly important and could disproportionately affect communities of color. So all of these commissions are important because that work continues. So just because this bill passed doesn't mean the work is done. We need to keep the pressure to make sure that we have the most accountability, transparency, and community representation in law enforcement. You know, one of the areas that we overlap a lot with the chief and with law enforcement is that we want to make sure that law enforcement and public safety agencies, not just police, but also fire, are representative of the communities that they serve. And diversity matters. It matters not just in boardrooms, it matters not just in schools in terms of who's teaching the children, it matters in who is patrolling our streets. And so for us at Lawyers for Civil Rights, it's not just about aggressive enforcement of the police reform bill and pushing agenda items that remain undone, like qualified immunity. It's also helping law enforcement and public safety agencies to diversify so that we can have folks who look like us in the public safety agencies. And I would close with one additional point of advocacy, which is this issue, or if I may, two issues, but they're related. This issue, we're talking about it very much along the lines of race, particularly Black lives, which is absolutely critical. But I don't want us to forget that identity-based issues have always plagued law enforcement, right? We're talking about not just driving while Black, but also walking while trans, right? We're talking about people like Terrence Coleman, who was a young Black man. He was living with a disability. We don't talk about the disproportionate use of force against people with disabilities. And so even if Black Lives Matter doesn't ring to you, maybe there are other elements of disparities in law enforcement that ring to you, and we are all in that fight together. So we need to have a very big tent when it comes to police reform. And on that identity-based issue, I'll close with something that Chief KYES alluded to, which is immigration. We must ensure a divorce between law enforcement and immigration enforcement. This is something that is critical to continue to make victims and witnesses available so that they can come forward and share their stories so that they can seek justice. And so I put that on the table because too often we forget that there is a pathway between police enforcement and deportation. There's definitely a pipeline there, and we need to cut that short or eliminate it altogether, I should say. So thank you, Tanisha, for the question, and happy to continue this dialogue.
Absolutely. Thank you, Yvonne. And I actually want to lift up a question / comment that we have from Kevin Burchell. He's a 3L at UMass Law, and he asked a question about best practices in implementation, and specifically asking how advocates, if you're here, you're already an advocate. Kevin, you shouldn't say soon to be. Own it. How advocates can make certain that the reforms are implemented beyond protesting and calling attention to needs for reform. And I want to give that to you. But before I do, I want to lift up something you mentioned. It is true that in the 140 plus pages that Chief KYES mentioned that make up this legislation, there are many commissions and task forces that have been established. And what I want to note is that, most of those, not all of them, but most of those really speak to the unfinished business that we have. And I can speak to, those areas where the NAACP has a specific seat carved out. Those are areas where we advocated really hard and pushed really hard. But again, they were left on the table to fight another day. And so I say that to say, Kevin and others who are listening, there are opportunities to serve on these commissions and to serve on these task forces, whether it's through this legislation or other legislation that is to come, or the commissions. You don't have to be, in most instances, you don't have to have a specific credential. And some you do, but what we're looking for, especially in the policing reform work, are folks who have really just life experience with these issues, right? Because that's the other piece of it. You can put, 10 lawyers in a room and 10 policy folks in a room and law enforcement in the room. But if there are not folks in the room who are, truly experiencing everyday people who are experiencing policing in the room, then we're missing an opportunity. So I want to encourage folks to, if you're interested in remaining engaged, look for opportunities to participate on some of these commissions, especially, those of you who have an interest in advocacy work and policy work. But with that, Yvonne, I'm going to go back to you. Can you talk a little bit more about unfinished business? You touched on certainly in your remarks the immigration piece of this. What else would you say is unfinished business?
Definitely the qualified immunity piece that you have put on the table is huge. Let's be very clear here. Police officers have a very difficult job. They should be applauded for the hard work that they do. And we also take what law enforcement says at its face value, because we believe it's true that much of what we see are bad apples. And if we are talking about bad apples, then we need to have a process for eliminating those bad apples, because a bad apple can spoil the bunch. And we need to make sure that the integrity of the work remains. And so for us, modernizing qualified immunity is critical as a critical process of ensuring accountability, making sure that those bad apples have a way to be held accountable. And frankly, no law enforcement agency should be associated with these folks. You know, one of the most disturbing things to me is that I often speak to prosecutors, and what they say is that they actually have a list of officers who cannot be brought into court to testify because they have been found to be unreliable. So let me get this straight. Your work is supposed to be the enforcement of criminal law, and yet you cannot take the stand in court because you are not reliable? Then what good are you? Why are you working in this job, and why have you not been eliminated? And so when we talk about things like the Peace Officer Standard and Training post, when we talk about police certification, when we talk about qualified immunity, that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about eliminating the bad apples. And so I think we have a lot of commonality on that thread. In addition to qualified immunity, I think some of the pieces that are really important to elevate surround structural racism and institutional racism within the criminal justice system. As you mentioned, the commissions address this in some way. Here I'm looking, for example, at the commission specified under Section 110 of the Reform Bill, which focuses on structural racism within correctional facilities, for example, or structural racism within parole and probation processes under Sections 111 and 112 of the Law Reform Bill. So there's a lot of these pieces to unpack. And so I think we cannot shy away from talking about the structural racism pieces. And I'll close with this. One of the asks that we have of the Biden administration, which we put public, is that we want the Biden administration to convene prosecutors to talk about best practices in being anti-racist and in making sure that we are all following the trends of what progressive prosecutors have been doing. Don't charge low-level offenses. This is the way that we can all be aligned. And so this work isn't just local or statewide. I think there are also federal implications here for ways that we can just not just think about police. They're not in isolation from prosecutors, from judges, from the rest of the criminal justice system. So let's not lose sight of that entire system, which is also in need of reform. I think just focusing on police officers misses the mark and tends to just look at one symptom of a systemic problem.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to actually, AJMEL, kind of give you that question as well. There's actually one from our audience, our guest. Kevin Corcoran asks, are there any efforts for Congress to create new causes of action for suits to be filed against law enforcement officers who abuse their discretion or violate rights? And I know that you talked a bit about some of the work that is happening, again, around qualified immunity. There's a linkage there. But could you just expound a bit more on what's happening at the national level?
Sure. So it's a couple of things are happening. It's not specifically related to new causes of action, but changing or adjusting the causes of action that already exist. One of the things that I talked about was the federal criminal civil rights statute, and the standard right now under the federal criminal civil rights statute is one of willful action. And it's oftentimes very difficult for civil rights lawyers or prosecutors who are doing civil rights work to be able to prove that bad action was willful. And so what some of the advocacy we've been doing around the national level is changing that standard to a reckless standard. Now let's be clear, reckless is not negligent. We're not talking about a situation where you're punishing someone where they, didn't realize what they were going to do would be harmful. We're talking about a situation where an officer would know that what they were doing was dangerous. They just wouldn't know specifically what the result of that harmful act would be, or wouldn't know specifically who would be injured. So I think that's one of the national efforts that we've been working on. I wanted to tie it to the bill, which I had the chance to read over, before this panel, and I think it's really interesting. It really creates a number of new causes of action, or at least routes for litigation to be pursued by individuals in the state attorney general's office. So I think for those of you who are residents of Massachusetts, and I'm not, I think there should be push on your state attorney general to sort of utilize these provisions. And I'll point out two. One, the Post has the ability to refer cases. Actually, I'll go in the other order. The one that I found particularly interesting is it allows the state attorney general to bring disparate treatment claims based on data disparities. And so if there's data regarding individuals being stopped or arrested on a disproportionate basis, that can be the first piece of evidence that would allow a state attorney general to look into whether or not there's disparate treatment, that is, individuals being targeted on the basis of race. So I think that is a great first step, and I think that's a really interesting piece of the new legislation that was passed. The other piece that I was referring to before is the Massachusetts legislation also creates a cause of action for state attorney generals to bring the equivalent of 1983 claims. We already know that private civil rights lawyers, as well as the federal government, can pursue the equivalent of 1983 claims. Those are claims for violations of federal constitutional rights, but now we're giving the state attorney general the power to do that as well. And that's really important because oftentimes that state attorney general is going to have a closer relationship with the individuals they represent in a community.
Excellent. Thank you. Very, very helpful. I want to go back to Rep. Gonzalez because we lost you as you were wrapping up your comments. I want to give you an opportunity to finish those comments, and then I'll have a question for you. You're on mute. There we go.
I'm not sure. Thank you, Tanisha. I'm not sure where I lasted. I had my fancy background due to the snow that we got, about 12 inches over here. But I think I lost connection. But again, I think I was just highlighting the great accomplishments.
Yes.
And to Yvonne's point, this is the beginning of work that needs to continue. It's an ongoing process. There's not one legislation of civil rights or social justice that has cured all the ills of impacting communities, particularly the communities of color. Nor did we set out to cure all the ills. We set out to set the agenda that establishes a better footprint into police accountability and transparency. And I think we accomplished that. And lastly, I think it was important to note that there's work to be done, but working together is going to be the way out of making sure that we have a transparent police force. And again, to Yvonne's point, when we talk about the bad apples, in one of my speeches, I highlighted that 1% or 2% or 5% of the bad apples in our police departments, that's who we're targeting. And right now in Massachusetts, I think we will have, this landmark legislation will lead the national agenda on changing and transforming how we look at police accountability throughout the country. Because we have, and I'm so excited that Amel, you highlighting the great little pieces of this legislation, because I think some folks got so stuck on QI and didn't read the 140, the 139 other pages that talks about the great work that was accomplished to make sure that we can hold our police accountable, certified, decertified, and lastly, when it comes to work, this is going to take money. The governor has not put in the funding in his budget right now to get this work done. We have to get our police commission, our post commission. We have to identify the training, the curriculum. The Mass Training Police Commission will work with our post commission to make sure that we can, get this off the ground and keep, the pedal to the metal, because I believe, and in talking with the commissioner, there will be some type of supplemental budget after they look at, my understanding is right now they are studying all the training for all police officers throughout the state, as well as getting all the data of police IA investigations across the state, because that is a huge part of the work that's going to take place as we move forward with the peace officer and independent body. So again, a lot was accomplished, a lot more work needs to happen, and I think we are focused on working together to get that accomplished.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. I want to note for those who are joining us that the link, the direct link to the new law has been placed in the chat for your reference. Rep. Gonzalez, I'm going to stay with you before I go to Rep. KYES. Before I go to Chief KYES, I'm going to stay with you for a moment, Rep. Gonzalez, because when we talk, one of the areas that was highly debated, and where, there was a lot of kind of within the 11th hour, concern raised was with respect to the role of, and this goes to a question that's in the chat as well, the role of law enforcement being actually being responsible for the training, setting the standards and training, right, for law enforcement. And there were some questions raised, different ideologies as it relates to whether there should be civilian involvement in that, or if it should stay with the MPTC. Can you talk a little bit about kind of your thinking and the Massachusetts Black and Latino Legislative Caucus's thinking on that particular issue? And then Chief KYES, I'd love to hear your thinking on that as well.
Sure. Again, we were very late into the session when the final passage of the conference committee and then the House and the Senate and then went to the governor's desk. And again, I do believe that what we wanted to get accomplished was that the standards of training would be, the curriculum would be proposed by the independent body, the post. Police officers and in the unions wanted to have some involvement. The Massachusetts training of police, they've been doing some of the curriculums in the past. So the governor thought that it was the best way to move forward in this bill. And again, with the last minute, we had to make sure that we got most of our bill passed. And that's how that came to be the part of the bill as we see it today. However, I think one of the important pieces of that is that we did have language in there that the post-commission independent body will have in agreement with the police, with the Mass Training Police Commission to establish that curriculum. And I think that's critical and important. When we talk about having civilians, that will be the civilian component of having and establishing the curriculum.
Thank you. Chief KYES.
Yeah, no, definitely. And he's 100% right. Right, for the longest time, we've had in terms of the Municipal Police Training Committee, we have 11 members. Of the 11 members, it's kind of spread out. There's 5 police chiefs, there's a transit, there's the state police has a rep, Boston Police. There's also the Attorney General's office, and there's also EOPS, which are civilians, for lack of a better term, or non-law enforcement, I guess I should say. But so what they did is in the legislation, they increased it from 11 members to 15. So now there's going to be 2 county sheriffs that are going to be part of the group, as well as a member of the Mass Association of Women in Law Enforcement and the Mass Association of Minority Law Enforcement Officers as well. So it's more of a more well-rounded group. Perhaps we could increase it more as well. But as the rep just mentioned, there's something known as the Division of Police Certification, which does fall under post, that many of the training requirements that the MPTC puts together, they're going to put together in conjunction with the Division of Police Certification. These folks, matter of fact, the legislation is very specific for the Division of Police Standards and the Division of Certification. They have to be non-law enforcement. So there is this joint partnership in terms of establishing standards. And that being said, just so you know, like in our state as well, we have something, the Massachusetts Police Accreditation Commission. So we don't operate in a vacuum. We look nationally for best practices, best training practices. There's something known as KYES, which is the Commission for Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. It's a national organization that's been in effect for many, many years. So in Mass, what we do is we take these KYES standards, we utilize them for police departments. We have 100 police departments right now that are accredited, and another 12 that are certified, which is one level below accreditation. The hope is that we can get all police departments, not just state police, not just local, colleges, universities, every single law enforcement agency in the state to be accredited with these training standards. So yeah, I think the idea of what we train in the police academy, what we train by law in terms of in-service, a mandatory minimum of at least 40 hours of training per year. And just so everyone knows, again, we don't train 40 hours. We train well beyond 40 hours. Some officers in the 100, 200, 300, but that baseline, that minimum baseline is the week's worth of in-service training. And I think the MPTC, I mean, I'm biased, I guess I've been on the committee for a number of years, but we do a lot of work in trying to stay ahead of the curve, a lot of work in listening to what the concerns are around the country, bringing them into our state, addressing protocols to address them. And at times these same issues are codified into law, but even if they're not, we stay ahead of the curve with training to make our officers the most professional police officers, hopefully in the entire country.
I want to thank you, Chief KYES. I want to stay with you for a moment. Sam Miano has a question, and he asked if can we discuss any cultural issues inherent in our law enforcement department. So here's the question: do you see problems or any issues around an us versus them kind of mentality between law enforcement and the community? And if so, how do we address those issues? Are there any solutions that are reflected in the new law?
So it's a great question. Mm-hmm. And I'll say this, that to be perfectly honest, going back a few months, if you ask that same question, I would say honestly, not so much. Meaning going back prior to the end of May, I think, as a matter of fact, with COVID, when COVID struck, there were many police agencies around the state where our residents were holding drive-by parades for us. I mean, for all frontline workers, but police, fire, and so forth. Certainly, things changed. Towards the end of May. We know what happened with George Floyd. We know what happened with Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. Matter of fact, the Ahmaud Arbery video, even though the incident happened back in February, was released in May. So it looked like everything was kind of compact and happening all at once. I think the us versus them, what occurred, and I'm a police officer, so I can speak to it. It just seemed that there seemed to be a groundswell of anti-police sentiment among some folks that you never really saw before. I know, like in law enforcement or policing in general, some people think, police officers, and whether it be Boston, Chelsea, those are busy places. They must go out there every night just looking to stop people and arrest people. And the reality is that's probably about 10%, maybe 15% of what we do, whereas the other 85% is community outreach and engagement and totally non-traditional things. Chelsea, Boston, Lawrence, we all have ice cream trucks. We drive around, we try to bridge the gap with our young folks and give out ice cream. And people kind of laugh when we started doing this, but these are things that are necessary. So the us versus them, again, if you asked me that some time ago, I would say, honestly, maybe, back some years, but certainly with the, the tidal wave of issues that have developed over this very controversial 2020, yeah, we're kind of back on our heels. I'm kind of back on my heels. I'm trying to keep my head up, my chin up, as are we all, because this is a learning opportunity. This is a moment in time that we have to learn from those situations. And again, we in law enforcement can't sit within a building and shut the doors and try to figure things out. We have to do what we're doing here tonight. We have to engage, we have to outreach, we have to get input from the members of our respective municipalities and see what they want, and we have to learn and grow together. So that's a great question. I'm hoping in a month or 2 or 3, or maybe shorter period of time, things will get a lot better, but little shaky right now, I think, for some folks across the Commonwealth that wear the badge.
Yeah, I just want to add just kind of a lens from community on that. I would say that specifically within the communities that I work very closely with, Black communities, the Latinx community, low income communities, other communities of color, there has been, I would say, for generations, a sense and an experience of being over policed and over surveilled, experiencing harsher consequences for, similar action that for other communities might end up with a slap on a wrist, but for children in our communities end up with, jail sentences. And so I do believe that to the point that Chief KYES has made, we hit in many respects one of our tipping points, historical tipping points last summer, where those tensions and the stratification between community and law enforcement really became more visible. What I will say in terms of when we think about solutions, like how do we address that? I mean, one is certainly trust. We've got to keep building up the trust between community and law enforcement. And one of the ways that we can do that is by ensuring that community is at the table, not just as it relates to programmatic solutions, but also as it relates to policy solutions, right? When we are talking about this work here around, whether it's legislative or it's policy within departments or agencies, ensuring that there's a voice and that the people have the pen. And have the ability to co-construct, to co-design the solutions that can help to create and sustain more trust and thereby build relationships. And so I would love to get a reaction to that thought from AJMEL and from IVÁN. I'll start with AJMEL.
So a couple of thoughts. First, I think the post committee is really interesting because in addition to the officers like Chief KYES and others, it calls for the appointment of one judge, one social worker, and one civil rights attorney. So, I mean, I think that is, if we're talking about voices of the community, I think that's getting closer to what TANISHA is talking about. And I think that is really kind of revolutionary, that it calls for a civil rights attorney to be put in there. There were two other things that I think are really important and go to what Chief KYES and Ms. Sullivan were talking about. One is there's provisions requiring the MPTC committee to create anti-bias training program for police officers as part of the legislation. So I think that can help play a role. I'm not someone who believes that debiasing or really limiting the effects of bias, because bias itself is very difficult to eliminate, are a solution in themselves. But I think that it's a very productive first step. And I think Chief KYES and others who probably serve and have experience serving on the MPTC probably have a deeper understanding of how the creation of that anti-bias program called for has been created or is in the works of being created, and how that's played out in terms of its implementation. And then finally, I think the last thing I wanted to go to is this last piece all the way at the end of the legislation in section 117, which calls for the study of alternative crisis intervention services. And that, I mean, I think that the term, and I think everyone's been shying away from it throughout this conversation, defunding the police. And I think there are different understandings of what that term means. But I think that piece at the end in 117 is really important, because it goes to that larger piece of transformational change that we're talking about, what the role of the police should be, and what things are the types of things that police should be responding to, and what are things that other parts of our government and social services should be responding to. So I think those are three really important pieces that can get to addressing the long-term cultural issues that we're talking about.
Yvonne.
Absolutely want to piggyback off of what AJMEL just said. I love that he's calling out the elephant in the room. But I will admit, I do not use the term defund police, nor do I think we should defund police. I think at least the way that we look at it from the perspective of Lawyers for Civil Rights is that we should right-size the scope of police functions and responsibilities. And actually, AJMEL, you did a really fabulous job at the beginning of this conversation saying, and I even wrote it down, you were talking about homelessness and about the way that putting homelessness under the umbrella of things that law enforcement is doing has resulted intentionally or unintentionally in the criminalization of homelessness. And so that's, I think, the perfect example. And so I want to echo what you put on the table at the very beginning of the conversation. That is the perfect example. Is that the right use of law enforcement resources? Is that the highest and best use of the chief's time and his men and women? I think we should have a conversation about that. And so I don't use the term defund because I think it's extraordinarily loaded. And I think it's better to talk about it as the right sizing of functions and responsibilities. And so I welcome that. And then the other point that I want to make in response to our wonderful moderator Tanisha's question is, I just want to take a step back, because I think there's another elephant in the room. So as we're naming elephants, I might as well name mine, which is I have a very hard time talking about this issue without connecting it to the white supremacist coup attempt at the US Capitol. I'm just going to put it out there, because in that moment, we saw racial disparity at its very worst. We saw law enforcement who would have shot and killed, because I'm going to go there, Black and brown bodies, if they had been attempting to go armed to the teeth into a federal building in session as the transition of power established by the US Constitution was happening. And so let's be very clear about who is at the receiving end of police violence and of, frankly, improper deployment of public resources. And so for me, this conversation about how we inform policy and how we inform law, which is exactly where you're going, Tanisha, it's connected deeply to our values as a people, to our institutions as Americans, and our racialized history. And so we need to change hearts and minds at a very basic premise to be able to have this conversation at the level we need to have it. Because if things are happening at the US Capitol that would have gotten me killed if I would have been there, but all those white people are getting away literally with murder, then we need to have a conversation about how policing unfolds. And so for me, the question you're talking about, Tanisha, which I'm so glad it's going in this direction. AJMEL, you are right. This is about how the scope of law enforcement responsibilities should be adjusted in light of recent history. And this doesn't end with George Floyd or Terrence Coleman. It started at the US Capitol.
Yeah, I think, very powerful points. And we actually had a question, and I was looking for it feverishly because we have so many wonderful questions about really the role of white supremacy within our law enforcement. And I apologize, I cannot find the question. I had it handy, but I can't find it right now. But to the point here is that what can no longer be kind of what we can no longer have blinders on post January 2nd. Is how I'm not suggesting that is the role that white supremacy can play in our law enforcement, and how and really thinking about what we need to do to root it out. And, to AJMEL's point, it's hard to do that through training. It's a cultural shift. To your point, IVÁN, it's about hearts and minds. What I do think and would love to hear from anyone on the panel on this point is, are there other ways that we can, when we think about members of law enforcement, other ways that we can help to root out white supremacy within law enforcement? It's not lost on me that there were some members of our military who were excused from service on January 20th because of their alleged affiliation with white supremacists. So would love to hear, aside from training, what are some of the other ways that we can seek to root out white supremacy?
Well, Tanisha, just, being the only police officer, I'll just say this real quick. So 100% right. Training is training. Officers need to be trained, certainly, but there needs to be mechanisms in place to identify those individuals that cross the line, whether it be an incident that, like was mentioned at the Capitol, whether it be an officer that is rude or discourteous to somebody that commits a violation of the law, somebody that hurts somebody, uses excessive force. There has to be mechanisms to investigate this misconduct. And there has to be accountability. If that means prosecuting somebody, prosecuting a police officer, so be it. If that means terminating a police officer, so be it. If that means something that's misconduct is less than what I just described, and suspending somebody for a day, for 5, for 30 days, I won't tell you how many officers I've had to terminate in 14 years, but it's more than I can put on one hand. And that's because we have mechanisms in place to identify the wrongdoing and hold people accountable, and be transparent with that. Let the folks know that we work for, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and so forth. And this legislation goes a long way in that respect, with posts, with that division of police standards for all of our data, our investigations to be submitted directly to post. They can conduct an audit of any police department at any time. So training is one component, is one side of the house, if you will. The other side, in terms of the accountability, yes, it has to be at its highest level here in the Commonwealth and across the entire country.
Excellent. Well, I think that that's a perfect way to end it. Chief KYES put a fine point on that, a period on that. And we greatly appreciate it. We have so many questions left. There's so much interest in this topic, but we are out of time. What I want to do as we're closing is just to remind us that we are here because of the Rappaport Center for Law and Policy. And so while there's certainly, as has been noted, many things that we can do, using the law to help bring about greater accountability and transformation in this space, there continues to be an important role for public policy. And I just want to emphasize that we all not only have a role to play in shaping public policy, But we all absolutely deserve to have our voices heard when it comes to the design of public policy, particularly when it comes to the health and safety and well-being of our communities. So I want to encourage all of you to continue to be engaged. You can certainly reach out to Attorney IVÁN ESPINOZA-MADRIGAL at the Lawyers for Civil Rights. If you're interested in doing more work in this space and supporting the work of LCR, certainly reaching out to Rep. Gonzalez and really any of our legislators at the State House who will continue to work on these efforts and will continue to try to advance policing reform here and accountability here in the Commonwealth. And Chief KYES, we know that you will continue to play a critical role on the implementation side of this. And so certainly as folks are who continue to have an interest, I would encourage you to learn more about the MPTC and also learn more about the post and how that will function and continue to follow the, again, implementation of this legislation. And then finally, Professor QUERESHI, welcome again to BC Law. Welcome again to our community. And I'm super excited about you being here. Look forward to working with you. We welcome you to the civil rights advocacy community here and students and other attendees. I encourage you to follow the work of the professor during his fellowship here. With that, and of course, you can always reach out to me as well. We will continue as a branch we'll continue to be engaged in this work and continue to follow its implementation. With that, I want to thank Dean Rougeau, Professor Canstrom, and Lissy for the invitation to be a part of this important conversation. And I'm going to turn it back over to Lissy.
Yes.
Okay.
With that, I just want to say thank you so much to all of you. Tanisha, you are a remarkable moderator, a remarkable person, and we're so grateful that you always say yes. Tanisha always says yes. And to IVÁN and AJMEL and Chief KYES and Representative Gonzalez, thank you for joining us. This was a really important conversation, really informative conversation, a conversation that hopefully will be a call to action for everybody who's here, especially the law students who are here. There are many opportunities, as Tanisha said, many opportunities for people to get engaged and to really work towards true justice for everyone, which is clearly the goal here. And so thank you to all of you. Stay in touch with the Rappaport Center. 2 weeks from today, we have a program on evictions, also a very important topic happening here in Massachusetts. So please join us, and thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.